In the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, where every whisper echoes with centuries of royal secrets, Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell discovered something that would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. What started as routine security checks on young Prince George turned into a nightmare that threatened not just one child's life, but the entire royal lineage. The mysterious bite marks on the 10-year-old prince's neck weren't from any ordinary predator. They bore the unmistakable pattern of something far more sinister. Something that had been hunting the royal family for generations, hidden in plain sight among trusted servants and advisors. As Sarah delved deeper into the palace's dark underbelly, she realized that protecting Prince George meant confronting an ancient enemy that had been feeding off royal blood for over 2 centuries. Time was running out, and the next full moon was only days away. The question wasn't just who was behind these attacks, it was how many others within the palace walls had already been turned, and whether Sarah could save the future king before she became the next victim. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell had been protecting the royal family for 8 years, but she had never encountered anything like what she discovered on that foggy October morning. The call came at 5:47 a.m., just as she was finishing her morning coffee in the security office of Kensington Palace. Prince George's nanny, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, had found the young prince in his bed with strange marks on his neck. Sarah rushed through the palace corridors, her footsteps echoing against the marble floors. The ornate paintings of past monarchs seemed to watch her with knowing eyes as she made her way to the private quarters. When she arrived at Prince George's room, she found the 10-year-old sitting on his bed, looking pale and confused. "I had the strangest dreams," Prince George told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "There was someone in my room, but they weren't really there. They were like a shadow that could move and speak." Sarah examined the marks on his neck carefully. They were unlike anything she had seen before. 2 small puncture wounds, perfectly circular and deep enough to have drawn blood. The skin around them was slightly bruised. But what troubled her most was how precise they were. These weren't random scratches or bites from an animal. They were deliberate, almost surgical in their placement. Mrs. Hartwell, a woman in her 50s who had been caring for royal children for over 20 years, stood nervously by the window. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, wringing her hands. "I checked on him before I went to bed at 11 o'clock, and he was perfectly fine. The windows were locked, the door was secured, and I was sleeping right next door." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She began documenting everything: the position of the marks, the time they were discovered, the condition of the room. The windows were indeed locked from the inside, and there were no signs of forced entry. The security cameras in the hallway showed no unusual activity throughout the night. It was as if whoever had done this had simply materialized in the room. Prince William and Catherine arrived within minutes of being notified. The concern on their faces was evident as they rushed to their son's side. Catherine immediately pulled George into a protective embrace while William questioned Sarah about the security protocols. "How is this possible?" Prince William demanded, his voice tight with worry. "This is supposed to be one of the most secure buildings in the country. How did someone get into my son's room without triggering a single alarm?" Sarah had been asking herself the same question. The palace's security system was state-of-the-art, with motion sensors, cameras, and guards stationed at every entrance. The private quarters were especially well protected, with additional layers of security that made unauthorized access nearly impossible. Dr. Margaret Thompson, the royal family's personal physician, arrived shortly after to examine Prince George. She was a woman in her early 60s with a reputation for discretion and excellence. As she checked the boy's vital signs and examined the marks more closely, her expression grew increasingly concerned. "The wounds are clean," she reported to Sarah and the royal parents. "Almost too clean. There's minimal tissue damage around the puncture sites, which suggests they were made with something very sharp and precise. The blood loss is minimal, but..." She paused, looking troubled. "But what?" Catherine asked, her voice strained with worry. "There are traces of an unknown substance around the wounds. Dr. Stupy," Thompson explained. "Something that appears to have anticoagulant properties. It's preventing the blood from clotting properly, which would explain why the wounds are still slightly bleeding despite being several hours old." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. An anticoagulant substance suggested this wasn't a random attack or even a simple assault. Someone had come prepared with tools and chemicals designed to extract blood efficiently. The implications were disturbing beyond measure. She immediately ordered a complete lockdown of the palace while she began her investigation. Every staff member who had access to the private quarters was to be questioned, and a thorough search of the premises was to be conducted. She also requested that specialist forensic teams be brought in to analyze the unknown substance found at the wound sites. As the morning progressed, Sarah interviewed the night shift guards, the cleaning staff, and anyone else who might have been in the vicinity of Prince George's room. Each person had an alibi, and their stories checked out. The night guards reported no unusual activity, and the cleaning staff had finished their duties in that section of the palace by 10 p.m. the previous evening. Lord Chamberlain Sir Edward Pemberton, a distinguished man in his 70s who oversaw the royal household operations, was particularly helpful in providing Sarah with detailed information about the palace's security measures and staff protocols. He had served the royal family for over 30 years and took the security breach as a personal affront. "In all my years of service," he told Sarah, "nothing like this has ever happened. The safety of the royal family is our highest priority, and we have systems in place that should make such an incident impossible." Sarah spent hours reviewing security footage from multiple cameras throughout the palace. She watched as guards made their regular rounds, staff members completed their evening duties, and the royal family retired to their quarters. Everything appeared normal until she reached the footage from the camera positioned near Prince George's corridor. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the camera experienced what appeared to be a malfunction. The image flickered and went dark for precisely 12 minutes before resuming normal operation. When the feed returned, everything looked exactly as it had before the interruption. No evidence of tampering, no signs of anyone in the corridor, nothing that would suggest an intruder had passed through. The timing of the camera malfunction was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had deliberately disabled the surveillance system, but they had done it in a way that left no trace. This level of sophistication suggested that whoever was responsible had extensive knowledge of the palace's security systems and possibly inside help. Sarah's investigation revealed that the malfunction had affected only one camera, the one that would have captured anyone approaching Prince George's room. All other cameras throughout the palace had functioned normally throughout the night. The technical team examined the disabled camera and found no evidence of external interference or tampering. As evening approached, Sarah realized she was dealing with something far more complex than a simple break-in. The precision of the attack, the mysterious substance, the sophisticated security bypass, and the lack of any physical evidence pointed to something that challenged her understanding of conventional crime. She decided to expand her investigation beyond the immediate incident. If someone had targeted Prince George specifically, there might be patterns or previous incidents that had been overlooked or dismissed. She requested access to historical security reports and began looking for any unusual incidents involving the royal family over the past several months. What she found in those files would change everything she thought she knew about the dangers facing the royal family. Buried among routine security reports and minor incidents were several entries that suddenly took on new significance. 3 months earlier, Prince George had complained of nightmares and had been found sleepwalking on 2 occasions. 6 months before that, Princess Charlotte had experienced a brief illness characterized by fatigue and pale skin that doctors had attributed to a minor virus. Even more disturbing was a report from 18 months ago describing an incident where Prince Louis had been found in the palace gardens in the middle of the night, with no memory of how he had gotten there. At the time, it had been dismissed as childhood wandering, but now Sarah wondered if there was a more sinister explanation. The pattern was becoming clear, and it terrified her. Someone had been targeting the royal children for months, possibly years, and had been doing so with such subtlety that each incident had been explained away as natural childhood behavior or minor health issues. As night fell and the palace settled into its evening routine, Sarah knew she couldn't rely solely on conventional security measures. She positioned herself outside Prince George's room, determined to catch whoever was responsible if they attempted another attack. Armed with night vision equipment and communication devices, she prepared for what might be the longest night of her career. The castle was unusually quiet that evening, with only the distant sounds of night guards making their rounds and the occasional settling of the old building's structure. Sarah remained vigilant, watching every shadow and listening for any sound that might indicate an intruder's presence. At 1:30 a.m., she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The temperature in the corridor had dropped noticeably, and there was a strange stillness in the air that seemed unnatural. Even the usual sounds of the building's heating system had stopped, creating an eerie silence that made every small noise seem amplified. Then she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. A shadow moved along the wall near Prince George's door, but there was no one casting it. The shadow seemed to have substance and purpose, gliding smoothly across the surface, as if it were alive and independent of any physical form. Sarah's rational mind told her that what she was seeing was impossible, but her eyes didn't lie. The shadow approached the door to Prince George's room and seemed to seep underneath it like liquid darkness. She immediately activated her radio to call for backup while moving toward the door herself. The handle turned in her hand, but the door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked. It felt as if something was holding it shut from the inside. She applied more pressure, and suddenly the resistance disappeared, causing her to stumble forward as the door swung open. The room was empty except for Prince George sleeping peacefully in his bed, but Sarah could sense that something had been there moments before. The air was even colder inside the room, and there was a strange metallic scent that she couldn't identify. She checked the windows and found them still securely locked from the inside. As she approached the bed to check on Prince George, she saw that he was deeply asleep, almost unnaturally so. His breathing was slow and regular, but when she gently touched his shoulder, he didn't stir at all. It was as if he were under some kind of sedation. Sarah's backup arrived within minutes, but by then, whatever presence she had encountered was long gone. The other guards searched the room thoroughly and found nothing unusual except for the persistent cold temperature and the strange metallic smell that seemed to dissipate even as they investigated. The implications of what she had witnessed were staggering. Either she was dealing with someone using technology so advanced it seemed like magic, or she was confronting something that existed beyond the bounds of normal reality. Neither possibility offered much comfort, as she considered the safety of the young prince and his siblings. The next morning brought more questions than answers. Sarah had spent the remainder of the night documenting every detail of her encounter with the mysterious shadow, but when she read her own report in daylight, it sounded like the ravings of someone suffering from sleep deprivation and stress. Thompson returned to examine Prince George again, and found that the bite marks on his neck had not healed as expected. Instead of beginning to close and scab over, they remained fresh and continued to weep small amounts of blood. More troubling was the discovery that Prince George's blood count showed signs of anemia, despite the minimal blood loss from the visible wounds. It's as if something is drawing blood from him continuously, Dr. Morrow. Thompson explained to Sarah and the royal parents in a private meeting. The visible wounds are just the entry points. There's some kind of ongoing process that we don't understand. Sarah knew she needed expert help, but the sensitive nature of the case limited her options. She couldn't involve regular police or medical personnel without risking a media catastrophe that would endanger not just the royal family's privacy, but potentially their safety as well. After careful consideration, she reached out to Professor James Whitmore, a forensic specialist from Oxford University who had worked on classified government cases in the past. Professor Whitmore was in his late 50s with a reputation for both brilliance and discretion. More importantly, he had experience with unusual cases that fell outside normal criminal investigation parameters. When Professor Whitmore arrived at the palace that afternoon, Sarah briefed him on everything she had discovered. She watched his expression carefully as she described the shadow she had witnessed, expecting skepticism or concern about her mental state. Instead, he listened with intense concentration and took detailed notes. "Have you considered the possibility that you're dealing with someone who has access to experimental technology?" Professor Whitmore asked. "There have been developments in optical camouflage and projection systems that could create the effects you describe." Sarah appreciated his rational approach, but something about the incident felt beyond the realm of current technology. The temperature changes, the resistance at the door, the way the shadow had seemed to have substance while casting no physical presence. These elements suggested something that challenged conventional explanations. Professor Whitmore examined the forensic evidence from Prince George's room and the blood samples taken from the wound sites. His analysis revealed something that made Sarah's blood run cold. The unknown substance found around the wounds contained organic compounds that didn't match any known medical or chemical database. Whatever created this substance, Professor Whitmore explained, it's not manufactured. It appears to be naturally occurring, but from an organism that we haven't catalogued. The closest match I can find is to certain enzyme compositions found in the saliva of some rare species, but even that's only a partial match. The professor's findings forced Sarah to expand her investigation in directions she had never considered. She began researching historical incidents involving the royal family, looking for patterns that might stretch back generations. What she discovered in the palace archives sent chills down her spine. The royal archives contained records dating back centuries, and buried within those documents were accounts of similar mysterious incidents. In 1847, young Prince Albert Edward had experienced a series of night terrors accompanied by unexplained marks on his neck. In 1923, the future King Edward VIII had been found sleepwalking in the palace gardens with no memory of how he had gotten there. Most disturbing was a sealed file from 1952, the year Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne. The document described an incident where the young Princess Anne had been found unconscious in her room with bite marks on her neck. The official report attributed the marks to an animal bite, possibly from a palace cat, but the personal notes of the investigating physician told a different story. Dr. Harold Pemberton, father of the current Lord Chamberlain, had written detailed observations about the unusual nature of the wounds and the presence of an unknown substance that prevented proper healing. His notes also mentioned reports of strange shadows seen in the palace corridors and unexplained temperature drops in the vicinity of the royal quarters. Sarah realized that whatever was threatening Prince George had been targeting the royal family for generations. The attacks were carefully spaced and subtle enough to avoid detection, but the pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. She brought her findings to Professor Whitmore, who had been conducting his own research into similar historical cases. His face was grave as he reviewed the documents Sarah had discovered. "This isn't random," he said, spreading the papers across his desk. "There's a deliberate pattern here that suggests long-term planning and execution. Whatever is responsible has intimate knowledge of the royal family's routines and living arrangements." The professor's analysis revealed that the attacks tended to occur during periods of transition or vulnerability. Prince Albert Edward's incidents had happened during a time when his father, Prince Albert, was seriously ill. Princess Anne's attack had occurred shortly after her grandfather's death and her mother's accession to the throne. The recent targeting of Prince George coincided with increased public attention on the young prince as he began taking on more public duties. "It's as if something feeds on royal blood during times of stress or change," Professor Whitmore observed. "The question is whether we're dealing with a person who has developed this pattern over time or something else entirely." Sarah's investigation took a darker turn when she discovered that several long-term palace employees had been present during multiple incidents spanning decades. Lord Chamberlain Sir Edward Pemberton's family had served the royal household for over a century. Mrs. Margaret Ashworth, the head of housekeeping, had been working at the palace for 45 years. Even some of the senior guards had family connections to palace staff dating back generations. The possibility that someone within the palace's trusted inner circle was responsible for the attacks was almost too horrible to consider. These were people who had devoted their lives to serving and protecting the royal family. The idea that one of them might be a predator who had been systematically targeting royal children for decades challenged everything Sarah thought she knew about loyalty and trust. She began conducting discreet background investigations on all long-term staff members, looking for any anomalies or connections that might explain their involvement. The process was delicate because she couldn't afford to alert potential suspects to her suspicions, but she also couldn't ignore the possibility that the threat came from within. Professor Whitmore's laboratory analysis of the physical evidence continued to yield disturbing results. The organic compounds in the unknown substance showed characteristics that suggested they were designed to keep wounds open and prevent the body's natural healing processes. More alarming was the discovery that the substance contained what appeared to be a mild sedative component that would explain Prince George's deep, unnatural sleep during the attacks. "Whoever is doing this has extensive knowledge of biochemistry and human physiology," Professor Whitmore reported. "This isn't the work of an amateur or someone acting on impulse. The sophistication of the substances involved suggests years of research and development." The third night of Sarah's investigation brought a breakthrough that changed everything. She had installed additional monitoring equipment in Prince George's room, including thermal sensors and electromagnetic field detectors that would pick up anomalies that conventional cameras might miss. At 2:15 a.m., the thermal sensors registered a significant temperature drop in the room, but the electromagnetic equipment detected something even more unusual. There were fluctuations in the local magnetic field that suggested the presence of something with unusual properties, something that affected the environment around it in ways that defied normal physics. Sarah watched from her monitoring station as the temperature continued to drop and the magnetic field readings became increasingly erratic. Then, through the infrared cameras, she saw something that made her question her own sanity. A figure appeared in Prince George's room, but it wasn't quite solid. The thermal imaging showed a humanoid shape that was significantly cooler than room temperature, moving with fluid grace toward the sleeping boy. The figure appeared to lean over Prince George, and the magnetic field reading spiked dramatically. Sarah rushed toward the room, but by the time she arrived, the figure had vanished. Prince George was still asleep, but examination revealed fresh bite marks on the opposite side of his neck from the previous incident. The wounds were identical in size and depth to the earlier ones, confirming that the same entity was responsible for both attacks. This time, however, Sarah had documented proof of the supernatural nature of what they were dealing with. The thermal and electromagnetic readings provided evidence that something beyond normal human parameters was involved. The implications were staggering, but the evidence was undeniable. Professor Whitmore reviewed the data with a mixture of fascination and horror. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "We're not dealing with a human adversary using advanced technology. We're confronting something that exists at the boundaries of our understanding of reality." The professor's expertise in forensic science had not prepared him for evidence of paranormal activity, but his scientific training allowed him to approach the data objectively. The consistent readings from multiple instruments eliminated the possibility of equipment malfunction or misinterpretation. "The question now," he continued, "is how do we protect Prince George and the other royal children from something that can apparently materialize at will and bypass all conventional security measures?" Sarah realized that traditional law enforcement methods would be inadequate against this threat. She needed to find experts who dealt with paranormal phenomena, but doing so without compromising the royal family's security and privacy would be extremely challenging. Her research led her to Dr. Ferrado. Victoria Sterling, a professor of paranormal psychology at Cambridge University who had worked with government agencies on classified cases involving unexplained phenomena. Doctorate, Sterling had a reputation for taking a scientific approach to supernatural investigations while maintaining absolute discretion about her work. When Sarah contacted Dr. Sterling and provided her with the evidence they had gathered, the professor's response was immediate and alarming. "Based on what you've described, Doctor," Sterling said during their secure phone conversation, "you're dealing with what classical literature would call a vampiric entity. The systematic targeting of royal bloodlines, the precise nature of the wounds, the presence of anticoagulant substances, these are all consistent with historical accounts of vampiric attacks." The word vampire sent a chill through Sarah that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold that had been plaguing the palace. The idea that they were dealing with an actual vampire seemed preposterous, but the evidence was mounting in that direction. Dr. Sterling agreed to travel to London immediately to consult on the case, but she warned Sarah that time was running out. "If this entity is following traditional vampiric patterns," she explained, "the attacks will become more frequent and aggressive. The initial feeding episodes are usually reconnaissance. The entity is testing the victim's blood and establishing a connection. Once that connection is solidified, the victim becomes increasingly vulnerable." As Sarah prepared for Dr. Sterling's arrival, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against an invisible clock. Prince George's health was deteriorating despite the seemingly minor nature of his wounds, and the attacks were becoming bolder. Whatever was stalking the royal family had been patient for generations, but now it seemed to be accelerating its timeline for unknown reasons. The palace felt different as night approached, for the fourth time since the attacks began. There was an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh on everyone within its walls. Even the usually cheerful staff members appeared nervous and subdued, as if they could sense that something malevolent was stirring in the ancient corridors. Sarah doubled the security around the royal quarters and implemented new protocols that required constant monitoring of all entrances and exits. She also arranged for Prince George and his siblings to be moved to a more secure location within the palace, though she wondered if conventional security measures would be effective against an entity that could apparently phase in and out of solid matter. As midnight approached, Sarah found herself wondering if she was prepared for what the night might bring. The evidence suggested they were dealing with something that existed beyond the realm of normal human experience, and she wasn't sure that courage and determination would be enough to protect the royal children from a predator that had been hunting their bloodline for centuries. Dr. Victoria Sterling arrived at Kensington Palace under the cover of darkness, her credentials allowing her access to the most classified levels of the investigation. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp intelligence behind wire-rimmed glasses and an air of quiet authority that immediately commanded respect from the palace staff. Her examination of the evidence Sarah had collected was thorough and methodical. She spent hours reviewing the thermal imagery, electromagnetic readings, and historical documents, occasionally making notes in a leather journal that looked ancient enough to have belonged in a medieval library. "The pattern is consistent with what historical texts refer to as a noble bloodline vampire," Dr. Sterling explained to Sarah and Professor Whitmore during a late-night briefing in the secure conference room. "These entities specifically target royal or aristocratic families, feeding not just on blood, but on the power and lineage that the blood represents." She opened her journal to pages filled with handwritten notes and detailed diagrams. "According to records I've studied from various European royal courts, these creatures can live for centuries, establishing themselves within the household infrastructure of their chosen targets. They often take on trusted roles that give them access to their victims while maintaining their cover over extended periods. Sarah felt a chill as the implications became clear. You're saying that our perpetrator might be someone who's been working in the palace for decades? Possibly centuries, Dr. Sterling corrected. These entities can maintain human appearance indefinitely, aging at an extremely slow rate that allows them to maintain their positions for generations. They typically explain their longevity by having family members take over their roles, but in reality, it's the same individual continuing their predation. Professor Whitmore examined Dr. Sterling's historical documentation with scientific skepticism, but the evidence was compelling. Royal courts across Europe had recorded similar incidents stretching back to the Middle Ages, often dismissed as superstition or political intrigue, but sharing remarkably consistent details with their current situation. The electromagnetic signatures you've detected are particularly significant, Doctor, Sterling continued. Vampiric entities exist partially outside normal physical reality, which explains their ability to phase through solid matter and manipulate electronic systems. The temperature drops occur because they literally drain energy from their environment. Sarah's mind raced as she connected the dots. The camera malfunction. It wasn't sabotage. The entity's presence disrupted the electronic systems. Exactly. And the substance found in Prince George's wounds isn't manufactured. It's a natural secretion that these creatures produce to facilitate feeding while keeping their victims alive and relatively healthy for extended periods. Dr. Sterling's explanation shed new light on the historical incidents Sarah had discovered. Rather than random attacks, they represented a systematic harvesting that had been going on for generations, with the vampire carefully spacing its feeding to avoid detection while maintaining a renewable source of royal blood. The question now, Dr. Sterling said, is identifying which member of the palace staff is actually the vampire. Given the historical timeline, we're looking for someone whose family has allegedly served the royal household for several generations, but who might actually be the same individual maintaining a facade of hereditary service. Sarah immediately thought of the long-term staff members she had been investigating. Sir Edward Pemberton's family had served the royal household for over a century, but now she wondered if it had actually been Sir Edward himself the entire time. The thought that she had been working alongside a centuries-old vampire was both terrifying and infuriating. How do we identify and stop something like this? Sarah asked. Our conventional weapons and security measures are obviously useless. Dr. Sterling reached into her briefcase and withdrew several items that looked more like museum pieces than practical tools. There was an ornate silver cross, a vial of what appeared to be water, and several wooden stakes with intricate carvings along their length. Traditional methods still work, she explained, but they require precise application and absolute certainty about your target. A mistake could be catastrophic, both for the innocent person you might harm and for the exposure of supernatural elements to the public. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Sarah's shoulders. Not only was she protecting the royal family from a supernatural predator, but she had to do so without creating a scandal that could destroy the monarchy's credibility or endanger countless other people if the existence of vampires became public knowledge. Dr. Sterling outlined a plan that would require careful observation and strategic positioning. The vampire will need to feed again soon. The intervals between attacks have been shortening, which suggests either increasing hunger or preparation for a more significant harvesting event. We need to catch it in the act, but we also need irrefutable proof of its supernatural nature before we act. The fifth night since the attacks began brought an atmosphere of tension that seemed to permeate every corner of the palace. Sarah had positioned herself with Dr. Vitralio, Sterling and Professor Whitmore in a monitoring station that gave them visual access to multiple corridors while keeping them hidden from potential observation. At 11:30 p.m., Sir Edward Pemberton made his usual evening rounds, checking security protocols and ensuring that the royal quarters were properly secured. Sarah watched him through the surveillance monitors, noting his precise movements and professional demeanor. Could this distinguished gentleman who had served the crown for decades really be a centuries-old vampire? Dr. Sterling observed Sir Edward's behavior with clinical attention. Watch his reflection in the polished surfaces, she instructed. Vampiric entities often have irregular reflections or cast shadows that don't match their apparent position. As they watched, Sarah noticed something unsettling about Sir Edward's reflection in the marble surfaces of the corridor. It seemed slightly out of sync with his movements, as if there was a fractional delay between his actions and their reflection. More disturbing was the observation that his shadow appeared to move independently at times, shifting position without corresponding movement from Sir Edward himself. At midnight, the temperature monitoring systems began registering drops throughout the palace, but the pattern was different from previous nights. Instead of isolated cold spots, the entire building seemed to be cooling systematically. as if something was drawing energy from every room simultaneously. "This isn't a feeding pattern," Dr. Sterling observed with growing alarm. "This is preparation for something much larger. The entity is gathering power for a major manifestation." Sarah's radio crackled with reports from guards stationed throughout the palace. Multiple electromagnetic anomalies were being detected, security cameras were experiencing intermittent malfunctions, and several staff members had reported feeling unusually drowsy and disoriented. "It's not just targeting Prince George," Sarah realized. "It's affecting everyone in the palace. Why?" Dr. Sterling's expression was grim as she consulted her notes. According to historical accounts, when a noble bloodline vampire prepares for a major feeding event, it weakens all potential threats in the vicinity. The drowsiness and disorientation will incapacitate anyone who might interfere with its plans. The implications were terrifying. Not only were the royal children in immediate danger, but every person in the palace was being systematically weakened to prevent interference with whatever the vampire was planning. At 12:45 a.m., the monitoring equipment detected massive electromagnetic disturbances centered around the royal quarters. Sarah and her team rushed toward the disturbance, but they found the corridors filled with an unnatural darkness that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. The temperature dropped so dramatically that their breath was visible in the frigid air. Moving through the corridor felt like wading through thick liquid, as if the very atmosphere was resisting their progress. When they reached Prince George's corridor, they found Sir Edward Pemberton standing motionless outside the boys' room. But something was fundamentally wrong with his appearance. His form seemed to shift and waver, as if he were not entirely solid. His eyes glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. "Sir Edward," Sarah called out, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon, though she knew conventional arms would be useless. The figure that had been Sir Edward turned toward them with fluid, inhuman grace. When it spoke, its voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple directions simultaneously. "Detective Inspector Mitchell," it said.
And Sarah realized that this creature had been watching and evaluating her throughout her investigation.
"You have been most persistent in your inquiries, more persistent than most who have held your position over the decades." The casual reference to previous investigations spanning decades confirmed Dr. Sterling's theory. This creature had been operating within the palace for far longer than anyone had suspected, and Sarah was not the first security officer to stumble upon its activities. "You're not Sir Edward Pemberton," Sarah stated, trying to keep her voice steady despite the supernatural dread that seemed to emanate from the creature. "I am Sir Edward Pemberton," it replied with a smile that revealed elongated canine teeth. "I have been Sir Edward Pemberton for 83 years, just as I was his father before him, and his grandfather before that. The Pemberton family has served the royal household faithfully for over 2 centuries because we are all the same faithful servant."
The creature's admission sent chills through Sarah's entire body.
Not only had they been dealing with a vampire, but it had been hiding in plain sight among the palace's most trusted staff for generations, systematically feeding on royal blood while maintaining a facade of loyal service. Dr. Sterling stepped forward, holding the silver cross prominently. "What do you want with Prince George? Why target him specifically?" The vampire's expression became predatory as it focused on the young prince's room. "The boy carries the direct bloodline of kings stretching back 1,000 years. His blood is not merely sustenance, it is power incarnate. With the proper preparation and the right circumstances, consuming that bloodline could grant abilities beyond imagination." Sarah realized they were witnessing the climax of a plan that had been centuries in the making. The vampire hadn't just been feeding on royal blood. It had been preparing for a final, transformative event that would use Prince George's royal lineage to enhance its own supernatural abilities. The previous feedings were preparation, the vampire continued, seeming to enjoy their growing horror. Each drop of royal blood consumed creates a connection, a resonance that will allow for complete absorption during the final feeding. Tonight, under the new moon when the barriers between worlds are thinnest, I will complete what my kind has attempted for a millennium. The creature began moving toward Prince George's door, and Sarah knew that conventional resistance would be futile. Whatever was about to happen would determine not just Prince George's fate, but potentially the future of the entire royal bloodline. Dr. Sterling grabbed Sarah's arm and whispered urgently, "The vampire's most vulnerable during the actual feeding process. That's when we'll have our only chance to stop it, but we need to get inside that room." Sarah nodded, understanding that they were about to engage in a battle that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, duty, and the supernatural forces that lurked in the shadows of even the most protected places on Earth. As the vampire approached Prince George's door, Sarah noticed that the wood was beginning to frost over from the creature's presence. Whatever was about to happen would push the boundaries of reality itself, and she prayed that she would be strong enough to protect the innocent child who had become the focal point of an ancient supernatural war. The palace around them seemed to hold its breath as centuries of careful planning reached their climax. In the next few minutes, either Prince George would become the victim of an ultimate vampiric transformation, or Sarah and her allies would find a way to end a threat that had been stalking the royal family since before anyone could remember. The vampire placed its hand on Prince George's door, and Sarah watched in horror as the wood began to dissolve under its touch, creating an opening that bypassed all the room's security measures. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the stakes had never been higher. As the vampire dissolved the door to Prince George's room, Sarah felt time slowing around her. Every instinct screamed that she should charge forward, but Dr. Sterling's grip on her arm held her back. The paranormal expert was right. They needed to wait for the optimal moment when the creature would be most vulnerable. Through the supernatural opening in the door, they could see Prince George sleeping deeply in his bed, completely unaware of the ancient evil approaching him. The vampire moved with predatory grace, its form becoming more solid and defined as it focused on its ultimate goal.
"Remember," Dr. Sterling whispered, pressing the silver cross into Sarah's hand.
"The moment it begins the final feeding ritual, it will be locked into a vulnerable state.
That's when we strike, but not before. If we attack too early, it could escape and disappear for decades before attempting this again." Sarah gripped the cross tightly, feeling its unusual warmth against her palm. The metal seemed to pulse with its own energy, as if it were alive and responding to the supernatural presence nearby. The vampire leaned over Prince George's bed, and Sarah could see the creature's true form beginning to manifest. Its human disguise was melting away to reveal something far more terrifying. Its fingers had elongated into claw-like appendages, its teeth had grown into prominent fangs, and its eyes now glowed with an inner fire that cast eerie shadows across the room. "Ancient blood of kings," the vampire whispered, its voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through the very structure of the building. "Power that has flowed through generations of rulers, now to become part of something greater." The creature placed one clawed hand on Prince George's forehead and another over his heart. Sarah watched in horror as dark energy began to flow between the vampire and the sleeping boy. Prince George's skin began to pale visibly, and his breathing became shallow and labored. "Now, Doctor," Sterling hissed, and Sarah burst into action. She rushed through the dissolved doorway with Dr. Fernata, Sterling close behind her. The vampire sensed their approach but couldn't immediately disengage from the feeding ritual without losing the power it had already begun to absorb. Sarah thrust the silver cross toward the vampire's back, and the moment it made contact, the creature screamed with a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The scream was so piercing that the windows in Prince George's room cracked, and alarms began sounding throughout the palace. The vampire spun toward them, its face contorted with rage and pain. Where the cross had touched it, smoke rose from burned flesh, and Sarah could see that the wound was not healing as it should have. "Foolish mortal," the vampire snarled, its form beginning to shift and blur. "You have no idea what forces you're interfering with." Doctor, Sterling threw the vial of holy water she had been carrying, and where the liquid struck the vampire, its flesh sizzled and steamed. The creature staggered backward, momentarily disoriented by the assault of consecrated elements. But even as they fought, Sarah could see that Prince George was not recovering from the interrupted feeding. The boy remained unconscious, his breathing shallow, and his skin had taken on a greyish pallor that suggested the vampire had already drained a significant amount of his life force. "The ritual has already begun," the vampire laughed, despite its obvious pain. "Even if you destroy me, the boy will fade away within hours." "The connection has been established, and without the proper knowledge to reverse it, his royal bloodline will be lost forever." Sarah's heart sank as she realized the true horror of their situation. Stopping the vampire might not be enough to save Prince George if the creature had already begun some kind of supernatural process that would continue even after its death. "How do we reverse it?" Sarah demanded, keeping the silver cross pointed at the creature. "You don't," the vampire replied with malicious satisfaction. "The ritual requires the willing sacrifice of the one who initiated it. I would rather die than give up what I have already claimed." Dr. Sterling had been examining Prince George, while Sarah kept the vampire at bay, and her expression was grave. "The child's life force is being drained continuously," she reported. "Whatever connection the vampire established is still active and accelerating." Sarah realized they were in an impossible situation. They needed the vampire alive to reverse the ritual, but the creature clearly had no intention of cooperating. Even if they could force it to reverse the process, there was no guarantee it would comply, or that it even had the ability to do so once the ritual had progressed beyond a certain point. The vampire seemed to sense her dilemma and began to laugh with genuine amusement. "You begin to understand the genius of my kind," it taunted. "We do not simply take what we want. We ensure that stopping us becomes impossible without losing what you sought to protect." But Dr. Sterling had been examining her ancient texts while monitoring Prince George's condition, and she suddenly looked up with a spark of hope in her eyes. "There is another way," she announced. "According to these records, the ritual connection works in both directions. If we can reverse the flow of energy, we can drain the vampire's power instead of the victim's life force." "How?" Sarah asked desperately, watching as Prince George's breathing became even more shallow. "It requires a blood relative of the victim to serve as a conduit," Dr. Sterling explained quickly. "Someone with the same royal bloodline who can redirect the connection back toward its source." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Prince William and Catherine were in the palace, but involving them would put them at enormous risk. However, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis were also present, and their shared bloodline with Prince George might be enough to establish the necessary connection.
"We need to get one of his siblings," Sarah said. "But Dr.
Sterling shook her head. "Too dangerous for another child. It has to be an adult with the royal bloodline, either Prince William or someone else with direct royal blood." The vampire had been listening to their conversation with growing alarm. "You have no idea what you're proposing," it warned. "Reversing the ritual could destroy everyone involved. The energy feedback could kill the entire royal family." Sarah had to make a decision that could determine the fate of the British monarchy. She could try to force the vampire to reverse the ritual voluntarily, attempt the dangerous reversal process that Dr. Sterling had described, or find some other solution before Prince George's condition became irreversible. "Get Prince William," she ordered Dr. Paul. Sterling explained the situation and let him decide. "It's his son, and it should be his choice." As doctor, Sterling hurried from the room. Sarah kept the Silver Cross trained on the vampire while monitoring Prince George's declining condition. The boy's skin was becoming increasingly translucent, and she could see dark veins beginning to show beneath the surface. "You're making a terrible mistake," the vampire continued to taunt her. "The reversal ritual has never been successfully completed. Every attempt has resulted in the death of everyone involved." Terror refused to let the creature's words shake her resolve. "Maybe that's because no one has ever been desperate enough to try it properly," she replied. "Or maybe previous attempts failed because they didn't have the right knowledge or preparation." Prince William arrived within minutes, his face pale with terror as Dr. Sterling explained the situation. When he saw his son's condition, his expression hardened with determination that reminded Sarah of his military training. "What do I need to do?" he asked without hesitation. Dr. Sterling began preparing the reversal ritual, using instruments and materials from her collection that looked like they belonged in a medieval alchemy lab. She drew complex symbols around Prince George's bed with what appeared to be salt mixed with silver dust, creating patterns that seemed to make the air itself vibrate with energy. "You'll need to place your hands on your son and focus all your will on drawing the connection away from the vampire and into yourself, Dr. Sterling instructed Prince William. "The danger is that you could end up absorbing all the supernatural energy that the vampire has accumulated over centuries. Your body might not be able to handle that kind of power." Prince William didn't hesitate. "My son's life is worth any risk to myself," he stated firmly, taking his position beside Prince George's bed. The vampire realized what was happening and began to struggle more violently against Sarah's restraint. "You fools!" it screamed. "You'll destroy yourselves and accomplish nothing." As Prince William placed his hands on his son, the symbolic circles around the bed began to glow with soft light. Sarah could feel energy crackling through the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The vampire's struggles became more desperate as it sensed its accumulated power beginning to slip away. "It's working," Dr. Sterling announced, monitoring the energy flows with instruments that registered the supernatural currents moving between father and son. "The connection is shifting, but slowly." Prince William, You need to focus harder on drawing the energy towards yourself. Sarah watched as Prince William closed his eyes and concentrated with visible effort. The glow around the ritual circle intensified, and she could see Prince George's color beginning to improve slightly. But she could also see the strain the process was putting on Prince William, whose hands were beginning to shake from the supernatural energy flowing through them. The vampire made one final, desperate attempt to break free from Sarah's control. It lunged toward the ritual circle, apparently intending to disrupt the reversal process, even if it meant destroying everyone in the room. Sarah intercepted it with the silver cross, driving the consecrated metal deep into the creature's chest. The vampire's scream this time was different. Not just pain, but the sound of something fundamental being torn apart. As the silver penetrated its heart, the creature began to dissolve, but not before the energy it had been accumulating for centuries was released in a massive surge that threatened to overwhelm Prince William. "Hold on!" Dr. Sterling shouted over the supernatural storm that was now raging in the room. "The energy release is almost complete." Sarah watched in terror as Prince William struggled to contain the massive influx of power. His entire body was glowing now, and she could see that he was being pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. But his determination to save his son never wavered. Finally, the energy surge began to subside, and the glow around the ritual circle faded to normal lighting. The vampire was gone, leaving only a small pile of ancient dust where it had been standing. Prince George's breathing had returned to normal, and his skin had regained its healthy color. But Prince William had collapsed, unconscious from the ordeal of channeling centuries' worth of supernatural energy through his human form. Dr. Sterling immediately began checking his vital signs while Sarah confirmed that Prince George was truly recovering. "They're both alive, Doctor," Sterling announced with relief. "Prince William will need time to recover from the energy overload, but there doesn't appear to be any permanent damage, and Prince George shows no residual effects from the vampire's feeding." Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full impact of what they had accomplished. They had not only stopped an ancient supernatural threat, but had done so without losing any members of the royal family. The vampire that had been stalking the monarchy for centuries was finally destroyed, and its victims had been saved. As medical personnel arrived to care for Prince William and Prince George, Sarah realized that her work was far from over. There would be official reports to file, security protocols to update, and the delicate matter of ensuring that the supernatural aspects of the incident remained classified. The palace would need to be thoroughly examined for any traces of the vampire's presence, and she would have to implement new security measures designed to detect and prevent similar supernatural threats in the future. The revelation that such creatures could exist and operate undetected for centuries had fundamentally changed her understanding of the dangers facing the royal family. 3 weeks after the vampire's destruction, Kensington Palace had returned to what appeared to be normal operation, but Sarah knew that everything had fundamentally changed. The official reports described the incident as a security breach involving an unstable individual with access to experimental chemicals, but the truth was known only to a select few who had been sworn to absolute secrecy. Prince George had recovered completely from his ordeal, with no apparent memory of the supernatural attacks. The young prince had returned to his normal routine of studies and royal duties, but Sarah noticed that he seemed more aware of his surroundings, and occasionally glanced at shadows with a wariness that suggested some subconscious memory of what had happened. Prince William had spent several days in recovery after channeling the vampire's accumulated energy, but the experience had left him with some unexpected changes. Dr. Cullen, Sterling's tests revealed that he now possessed heightened senses and reflexes that bordered on superhuman, apparently permanent effects of his exposure to centuries' worth of supernatural power. The energy absorption process seems to have enhanced rather than damaged his physiology, Dr. Sterling explained during one of their classified debriefings. In essence, Prince William has gained some of the vampire's enhanced capabilities without any of its weaknesses or bloodlust. These changes were carefully monitored and kept strictly confidential, but they actually made Prince William a more effective protector of his family. His enhanced awareness allowed him to detect potential threats that would escape normal human perception, creating an additional layer of security around the royal children. Sarah had been tasked with developing new security protocols that accounted for supernatural threats. Working with Dr. Blank, Sterling and a small team of specialists, she created detection systems that could identify electromagnetic anomalies, temperature variations, and other signs that might indicate paranormal activity. The palace was now equipped with monitoring equipment that most people would assume was related to conventional security, but which actually served as an early warning system against supernatural intrusions. Silver-lined barriers were installed in strategic locations, and blessed salt was incorporated into the building's cleaning routines, to create protective barriers that would be invisible to casual observers. Professor Whitmore continued his analysis of the evidence they had collected, working to understand the full scope of the vampire's activities over the centuries. His research revealed that the creature had been responsible for several mysterious incidents involving European royal families dating back to the medieval period. What we discovered here wasn't an isolated case, Professor Whitmore reported. This vampire appears to have been part of a larger network of supernatural predators that have been targeting royal bloodlines across Europe for over 1,000 years. The Pemberton identity was just one of many facades it maintained in different countries. The implications of this discovery led to discreet communications with security services in other countries, sharing enough information to help them identify and address similar threats without revealing the full supernatural nature of what they had encountered. Several European royal families quietly implemented enhanced security measures based on Sarah's recommendations. The investigation into the vampire's true history revealed that it had assumed multiple identities over the centuries, always positioning itself as a trusted servant or advisor to royal families. Bank records, property deeds, and genealogical documents showed a pattern of inheritance that was actually the same individual transferring assets between false identities. The creature had accumulated enormous wealth over the centuries, Professor Whitmore explained. Properties, investments, and artifacts that it used to maintain its various identities and fund its activities. We're working with financial authorities to trace and recover these assets, though much of it will likely remain hidden in accounts we may never discover. Sarah's role had evolved from royal protection officer to something more like a supernatural security consultant. Her experience with the vampire incident had made her one of the few people in government with practical knowledge of paranormal threats, leading to consultations on other unusual cases that couldn't be explained through conventional means. Dr. Sterling had become a permanent consultant to the royal security team, developing training programs that would help guards recognize signs of supernatural activity without requiring them to believe in concepts that might strain their rationality. The training was presented as preparation for dealing with adversaries using advanced technology or psychological warfare techniques. The key is giving people the tools to respond appropriately to unusual threats without necessarily understanding the supernatural nature of what they're facing, Dr. Sterling explained. A guard who knows to report electromagnetic anomalies and temperature variations can be just as effective as one who believes in vampires, and much less likely to panic or make mistakes. The children's security detail now included specialists who had been briefed on supernatural threats, though most of them believed they were protecting against technological warfare or psychological manipulation rather than actual monsters. This approach maintained operational security while ensuring that the royal family had protection against both conventional and supernatural dangers. Prince George's siblings, Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis, showed no signs of having been affected by the vampire's presence, but they were now under enhanced monitoring that would detect any unusual incidents before they could escalate. The children viewed the increased security as a response to general threat assessments rather than anything specifically supernatural. Catherine had been briefed on the true nature of what had threatened her son, and while she struggled to accept the reality of vampires and supernatural dangers, her maternal instincts made her fiercely supportive of any measures that would protect her children. She had quietly learned to recognize signs of paranormal activity and served as an additional layer of awareness within the family unit. The palace staff had been carefully vetted following the vampire incident, with background checks extending much deeper into family histories and employment records. Several long-term employees who had seemed above suspicion were quietly transferred to other positions when their histories revealed inconsistencies that could indicate supernatural influence. Sarah's investigation had also revealed that the vampire had been manipulating palace operations in subtle ways for decades, influencing staff assignments, security protocols, and even architectural modifications to create conditions that favored its activities. Reversing these changes required careful analysis to distinguish between legitimate operational decisions and supernatural manipulation. The creature's influence was incredibly subtle, Sarah reported during one of her briefings. It made small suggestions and recommendations over the years that gradually shaped the palace environment to support its predatory activities. Most of the changes seemed reasonable at the time, but taken together they created a systematic vulnerability that we're still working to correct. The replacement for Sir Edward Pemberton was chosen through a rigorous screening process that included not only conventional background checks, but also consultation with Dr. Sterling to identify any signs of supernatural influence. The new Lord Chamberlain, Sir Michael Thornton, was a retired military officer with a practical mindset that made him well suited to implementing the enhanced security measures. 3 months after the incident, Sarah received reports of unusual activities at other royal residences that suggested the vampire might not have been working alone. Strange electromagnetic readings at Windsor Castle and unexplained temperature variations at Sandringham House indicated that other supernatural entities might be operating within the extended royal estate system. "We may have only addressed one part of a larger threat network," Dr. Sterling warned during their analysis of these new incidents. Historical records suggest that vampires of this type often work in groups, with different individuals assigned to different targets or geographical areas. This realization led to an expansion of the protective measures to cover all royal residences, with monitoring systems and supernatural countermeasures installed throughout the properties used by the royal family. The scope of the operation required careful coordination to avoid drawing public attention to the unusual security enhancements. Sarah's team also began investigating historical disappearances and unexplained deaths among royal household staff over the past several decades. What they discovered was a pattern of incidents that suggested the vampire had been eliminating witnesses, or potential threats to its cover identity, throughout its time at the palace.
At least 12 suspicious deaths or disappearances over the past 40 years, Professor Whitmore reported, all involving staff members who had been investigating irregularities or asking uncomfortable questions about palace operations. The deaths were made to look like accidents or natural causes, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. The families of these victims were discreetly compensated, though they could never be told the true reason for their losses.
Sarah felt the weight of these discoveries heavily, knowing that her failure to detect the vampire's presence earlier had cost innocent lives. As the first anniversary of Prince George's attack approached, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of reality had been transformed by the experience. She had entered the investigation believing in conventional threats and rational explanations, but now she lived with the knowledge that ancient evils could hide behind trusted faces and supernatural predators could stalk their victims for centuries. The royal family had adapted to their new reality with remarkable resilience. Prince George continued his education and royal duties, now protected by security measures that accounted for both human and supernatural threats. Prince William's enhanced abilities had made him a more effective protector of his family, though he struggled sometimes with the isolation that came from possessing capabilities he could never fully explain to others. The incident had also strengthened the bonds between the family members who knew the truth. They had faced an existential threat together and survived through cooperation and sacrifice, creating a level of trust and mutual support that would serve them well in facing whatever challenges the future might bring. Sarah's final report on the incident was classified at the highest levels of government secrecy, with access restricted to a handful of individuals who needed to know about supernatural threats to national security. The official version would never be released to the public, but it served as a foundation for developing protocols to address similar threats in the future. As she walked through the palace corridors during her evening security rounds, Sarah remained vigilant for any signs of supernatural activity. The vampire's destruction had eliminated one ancient threat, but she knew that others might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for their opportunity to strike at the heart of the British monarchy. The palace felt different now, not just because of the enhanced security measures, but because everyone involved in the incident carried the knowledge that they had faced something beyond normal human experience and prevailed. It was a secret that bound them together, while separating them from those who lived in the comfortable illusion that the world contained only rational, explicable dangers. Sarah had become the guardian not just of the royal family's physical safety, but of the terrible knowledge that monsters were real, and that eternal vigilance was the price of protecting those she had sworn to serve. It was a burden she carried willingly, knowing that her experience and expertise might be all that stood between the royal children and the supernatural predators that hunted in the ancient shadows of power. The story of Prince George's mysterious bite marks had become a secret chapter in the hidden history of the British royal family, one that would never be told, but would forever influence how they understood the true nature of the dangers they faced. In the end, the greatest victory was not just that they had survived, but that they had done so without losing their humanity or their commitment to protecting others from the darkness that lurked just beyond the edges of the civilized world.